Hi, welcome back to Boccaccio and Wigs. This is Chaucer. Chaucer and I get our hair done at the same place. And he's going to help me out today, apparently. We're going to dive into the introduction of the Decameron, which, just like the preface, is also in the voice of Boccaccio himself as our narrator. He's about to introduce our other storytellers and kind of set the stage for all of the tales that follow. Good boy. Here we go. Here begins the first day of the Decameron, in which, after the author has explained why certain people, soon to be introduced, have gathered together to tell stories, they speak under the direction of Pampinia on any subject that pleases them most. Whenever, most gracious ladies, I consider how compassionate you are by nature, I realize that in your judgment the present work will seem to have had a serious and painful beginning, for it recalls in its opening the unhappy memory of the deadly plague just past. Dreadful and pitiful to all those who saw or heard about it. But I do not wish to frighten you away from reading any further, by giving you the impression that all you are going to do is spend your time sighing and weeping while you read. This horrible beginning will be like the ascent of a steep and rough mountainside, beyond which there lies a most beautiful and delightful plain, and the degree of pleasure derived by the climbers will be in proportion to the difficulty of the climb and the descent. And just as pain is the extreme limit of pleasure, so then misery ends with unanticipated happiness. This brief pain, and I say brief since it contains few words, will be quickly followed by the sweetness and the delight which I promised you before, and which, had I not promised, might not be expected from such a beginning. To tell the truth, if I could have conveniently led you by any other way than this, which I know is a bitter one, I would have gladly done so. But since it is otherwise impossible to demonstrate how the stories you're about to hear, or you're about to read, came to be told, I am obliged, as it were, by necessity to write about it this way. Let me say then, Let me say then that 1348 years, I got the year right, had already passed after the fruitful incarnation of the Son of God, when into this distinguished city of Florence, more noble than any other Italian city, which still holds up, there came a deadly pestilence, either because of the influence of heavenly bodies or because of God's just wrath as a punishment to mortals for our wicked deeds. The pestilence, originating some years earlier in the East, killed an infinite number of people as it spread relentlessly from one place to another, until finally it had stretched its miserable length all over the West. And against this pestilence no human wisdom or foresight was of any avail. Quantities of filth were removed from the city by officials charged with the task, and the entry of any sick person into the city was prohibited. Many directives were issued concerning the maintenance of good health. Nor were the humble supplications rendered, not once but many times, by the pious to God, through public processions or by other means, in any way efficacious. So nothing's working. For almost at the beginning of the springtime of the year in question, the plague began to show its sorrowful effects in an extraordinary manner. It did not assume the form it had in the East, where bleeding from the nose was a manifest sign of inevitable death, but rather it showed its first signs in men and women alike by means of swelling, either in the groin or under the armpits, some of which grew to the size of an ordinary apple, and others to the size of an egg, more or less. And the people called them gavaccioli. And from the two parts of the body already mentioned, in very little time, the said deadly gavaccioli began to spread indiscriminately over every part of the body. Then, after this, the symptoms of the illness changed to black or livid spots appearing on the arms and thighs, and on every part of the body. Sometimes there were large ones, and other times a number of little ones scattered all around. And just as the gaveccioli, that sounds like pasta. Just as the gaveccioli were originally and still are a very definite indication of impending death, in like manner these spots became to mean the same thing for whoever contracted them. Neither a doctor's advice nor the strength of medicine could do anything to cure this illness. On the contrary, either the nature of the illness was such that it afforded no cure, or else the doctors were so ignorant that they did not recognize its cause, and as a result could not prescribe the proper remedy. In fact, the number of doctors, other than the well-trained, was increased by a large number of men and women who had never had any medical training. At any rate, few of the sick were ever cured, and almost all died after the third day of the appearance of the previously described symptoms, some sooner, others later, and most of them died without fever or any other side effects. This pestilence was so powerful that it was transmitted to the healthy by contact with the sick, the way a fire close to dry or oily things will set them aflame. And the evil of the plague went even further. Not only did talking to or being around the sick bring infection and a common death, but also touching the clothes of the sick or anything touched or used by them seemed to communicate this very disease to the person involved. What I'm about to say is incredible to hear, and if I and others had not witnessed it with our own eyes, I should not dare believe it, let alone write about it, no matter how trustworthy a person I might have heard it from. Let me say, then, that the plague described here was of such virulence and spreading from one person to another that not only did it pass from one man to the next, but what's more, it was often transmitted from the garments of a sick. It was often transmitted from the garments of a sick or dead man to animals that not only became contaminated by the disease, but also died within a brief period of time. My own eyes, as I said earlier, were witness to such a thing one day. When the rags of a poor man who died of this disease were thrown into the public street, 2 pigs came upon them, and as they are wont to do, first with their snouts and then with their teeth, they took the rags and shook them around. And within a short time, after a number of convulsions, both pigs fell dead upon the ill-fated rags, as if they had been poisoned. From these and many similar or worse occurrences, there came about such a fear and such fantastic notions among those who remained alive that almost all of them took a very cruel attitude in the matter. That is, they completely avoided the sick and their possessions, and in so doing, each one believed that he was protecting his own good health. There were some people who thought that living moderately and avoiding any excess might help a great deal in resisting this disease, and so they gathered in small groups and lived entirely apart from everyone else. They shut themselves up in those houses where there were no sick people and where one could live well by eating the most delicate of foods and drinking the finest of wines. Doing so in moderation, allowing no one to speak about or listen to anything said about the sick and the dead outside. These people lived entertaining themselves with music and other pleasures that they could arrange. These people lived entertaining themselves with music and other pleasures that they could arrange. Others thought the opposite. They believed that drinking excessively, enjoying life, going about singing and celebrating, satisfying in every way the appetites as best one could, laughing and making light of everything that happened, was the best medicine for such a disease. These are like those Florida spring breakers. So they practiced to the fullest what they believed by going from one tavern to another all day and night, drinking to excess. And they would often make merry in private homes, house parties, doing everything that pleased or amused them most. This they were able to do easily, for everyone felt he was doomed to die, and as a result abandoned his property, so that most of the houses had become common property, and any stranger who came upon them used them as if they were their rightful owner. In addition to this bestial behavior, they always managed to avoid the sick as best they could. And in this great affliction and misery of our city, the revered authority of the laws, both divine and human, had fallen, almost completely disappeared. For like other men, the ministers and executors of the laws were either dead or sick or so short of help that it was impossible for them to fulfill their duties. As a result, everybody was free to do as he pleased. Many others adopted a middle course between the two attitudes just described. Neither did they restrict their food or drink so much as the first group, nor did they fall into such dissoluteness and drunkenness as the second. Rather, they satisfied their appetites to a moderate degree. But they did not shut themselves up. They went around carrying in their hands flowers or sweet-smelling herbs or various kinds of spices, and they would often put these things to their noses, believing that such smells were a wonderful means of purifying the brain, for all the air seemed infected with the stench of dead bodies, sickness, and medicines. These are like those essential oil network marketing, multi-level marketing salespeople. Others were of a crueler opinion, though it was perhaps a safer one. They maintained that there was no better medicine against the plague than to flee from it. Convinced of this reasoning and caring only about themselves, men and women in great numbers abandoned their cities. Others were of a crueler opinion, though it was perhaps a safer one. They maintained that there was no better medicine against the plague than to flee from it. Convinced of this reasoning and caring only about themselves, men and women in great numbers abandoned their city, their houses, their farms, their relatives, and their possessions, and sought other places, going at least as far away as the Florentine countryside. As if the wrath of God could not pursue them with this pestilence wherever they went, but would only strike those it found within the city walls. Or perhaps they thought that Florence's last hour had come, and that no one in the city would remain alive. And not all those who adopted these diverse opinions died, nor did they all escape with their lives. On the contrary, many of those who thought this way were falling sick everywhere. And since they had given, when they were healthy, the bad example of avoiding the sick, they in turn were abandoned and left to languish away without any care. Karma. The fact was that one citizen avoided another, that almost no one cared for his neighbor, and that relatives rarely or hardly ever visited each other. They stayed far apart. They didn't have Zoom. This disaster had struck such fear into the hearts of men and women that brother abandoned brother, uncle abandoned nephew, sister left brother, and very often wife abandoned husband, and even worse, almost unbelievable, fathers and mothers neglected to tend and care for their children as if they were not their own. Thus, for the countless multitude of men and women who fell sick, there remained no support except the charity of their friends, and these were few, or the greed of servants who worked for inflated salaries, hazard pay, without regard to the service they performed, and who, in spite of this, were few and far between. And those few were men or women of little wit, most of them not trained for such service, who did little else but hand different things to the sick when requested, or do so or watch over them while they died. And in this service, they very often lost their own lives and their profits. And since the sick were abandoned by their neighbors, their parents, and their friends, and there was a scarcity of servants, a practice that was previously almost unheard of spread through the city. When a woman fell sick, no matter how attractive or beautiful or noble she might be, she did not mind having a manservant, whoever he might be, no matter how young or old he was. and she had no shame whatsoever in revealing any part of her body to him, the way she would have done to a woman, when necessity of her sickness required her to do so. This practice was perhaps in the days that followed the pestilence the cause of looser morals in the women who survived the plague. And so, many people died who by chance might have survived if they had been attended to. Between the lack of competent attendance that the sick were unable to obtain and the violence of the pestilence itself, so many people died in the city both day and night that it was incredible just to hear this described, not to mention see it. Therefore, out of sheer necessity, there arose among those who remained alive customs which were contrary to the established practices of the time. It was custom, as it is again today, for the women relatives and neighbors to gather together in the house of a dead person, and there to mourn with the women who had been dearest to him. On the other hand, in front of the deceased's home, his male relatives would gather together with his male neighbors and other citizens, and the clergy also came. Many of them, or sometimes just a few, depending on the social class of the dead man. And we're talking about affluent dead men. Then, upon the shoulders of his equals, other noble guys, he was carried to the church chosen by him before death, with the funeral pomp of candles and chants. With the fury of the pestilence increasing, this custom, for the most part, died out, and other practices took its place. And so not only did people die without having a number of women around them, but there were many who passed away without having even a single witness present. And very few were granted the piteous laments and bitter tears of their relatives. On the contrary, most relatives were somewhere else, laughing, joking, and amusing themselves. Even the women learned this practice too well, having put aside for the most part their womanly compassion for their own safety. Very few were the dead whose bodies were accompanied to the church by more than 10 or 12 of their neighbors. And these dead bodies were not even carried on the shoulders of honorable and reputable citizens, but rather by grave diggers from the lower classes that were called Boccacci. Working for pay, they would pick up their beer, like pier, but with a B. They would pick up their beer and hurry it off, not to the church the dead man had chosen before his death, but in most cases to the church closest by, accompanied by 4 or 6 churchmen with just a few candles, and often none at all. With the help of these Boccacci, the churchmen would place the body as fast as they could in whatever unoccupied grave they could find, without going to the trouble of saying long or solemn burial services. The plight of the lower class, and perhaps a large part of the middle class, was even more pathetic. Most of them stayed in their homes or neighborhoods, either because of their poverty or because of their hopes for remaining safe. And every day they fell sick by the thousands. And not having servants or attendants of any kind, they almost always died. Many ended their lives in the public streets during the day or at night, while many others who died in their homes were discovered dead by their neighbors, only by the smell of their decomposing bodies. The city was full of corpses. The dead were usually given the same treatment by their neighbors, who were moved more by the fear that the decomposing corpses would contaminate them than by any charity they might have felt toward the deceased. Either by themselves or with the assistance of porters, when they were available, they would drag the corpse out of the home and place it in front of the doorstep, where usually in the morning, quantities of dead bodies could be seen by any passerby. Then they were laid out on biers, or for lack of biers, on a plank. Nor did a bier carry only one corpse. Sometimes it was used for 2 or 3 at a time. More than once, a single bier would serve for a wife and husband, 2 or 3 brothers, a father or son, or other relatives, all at the same time. And very often it happened that 2 priests, each with a cross, would be on their way to bury someone, when porters carrying 3 or 4 biers would just follow along behind them. And whereas these priests thought they had just 1 man to bury, they had in fact 6 or 8, and sometimes more. Moreover, the dead were honored with no tears or candles or funeral mourners. In fact, things had reached such a point that the people who died were cared for as we care for goats today. Thus it became quite obvious that the very thing which in normal times wise men had not been able to resign themselves to, even though then it struck seldom and less harshly, became as a result of this colossal misfortune a matter of indifference to even the most simple-minded people. So many corpses would arrive in front of a church every day and at every hour that the amount of holy ground for burials was certainly insufficient for the ancient custom of giving each body its individual place. When all the graves were full, huge trenches were dug in all of the cemeteries of the churches, and into them the new arrivals were dumped by the hundreds. And they were packed in there with dirt, one on top of another, like a ship's cargo, until the trench was filled. But instead of going over every detail of the past miseries which befell our city, let me say that the hostile winds blowing there did not, however, spare the surrounding countryside any evil. There, not to speak of the towns, which on a smaller scale were like the city, in the scattered villages and in the fields, the poor, miserable peasants and their families, without any medical assistance or aid of servants, died on the roads and in their fields and in their homes, as many by day as by night. And they died not like men, but more like animals. Because of this, they, like the city dwellers, became careless in their ways and did not look after their possessions or their businesses. Furthermore, when they saw that death was upon them, completely neglecting the future fruits of their past labors, their livestock, their property, they did their best to consume what they already had at hand. So it came about that oxen, donkeys, sheep, pigs, chickens, and even dogs, man's most faithful companion, were driven from their homes into the fields, where the wheat was left not only unharvested but also unreaped. And they were allowed to roam where they wished, and many of these animals, almost as if they were rational beings, returned at night to their homes without any guidance from a shepherd, full after a good day's meal. Leaving the countryside and returning to the city, what more can one say except that so great was the cruelty of heaven, and perhaps also that of man, that from March to July of the same year, between the fury of the pestiferous sickness and the fact that many of the sick were badly treated or abandoned in need because of the fear that the healthy had, more than 100,000 human beings are believed to have lost their lives for certain inside the walls of the city of Florence. Whereas before the deadly plague, one would not even have estimated there were actually that many people dwelling in the city. Oh, how many great palaces, beautiful homes, and noble dwellings, once filled with families, gentlemen, and ladies, were now emptied, down to the last servant. How many notable families, vast domains, and famous fortunes remained without legitimate heir? How many valiant men, beautiful women, and charming young boys who might have been pronounced very healthy by Galen Hippocrates and Asclepius, not to mention lesser physicians, ate breakfast in the morning with their relatives, companions, and friends, and then in the evening dined with their ancestors in the other world. Reflecting upon so many miseries makes me very sad. Therefore, since I wish to pass over as many as I can, let me say that as our city was in this condition, almost emptied of inhabitants, it happened, as I heard it later from a person worthy of trust, that one Tuesday morning, in the venerable church of Santa Maria Novella, there was hardly anyone there to hear the holy services except 7 young ladies, all dressed in garments of mourning as the times demanded, each of whom was a friend, a neighbor, or relative of the other, and none of whom had passed her 28th year, nor was any of them younger than 18. All were intelligent and of noble birth and beautiful to look at, well-mannered and gracefully modest. I would tell you their real names if I did not have a good reason for not doing so, which is this. I do not wish any of them to be embarrassed in the future because of what they said and what they listened to. Nor would I wish to give an opportunity to the envious, who are always ready to attack every praiseworthy life, to diminish in any way, with their indecent talk, the dignity of these worthy ladies. But so that you may understand clearly what each of them had to say, I intend to give them names which are either completely or in part appropriate to their personalities. We shall call the first and oldest, 28 years old, Pampania, and the second Fiammetta, the third Philomena, and the fourth Emilia. And we shall name the fifth Loretta and the sixth Neophile. Gotta Google that. And the last, not without reason, we shall call Alyssa. Not by any previous agreement, but purely by chance. They gathered together in one part of the church and were seated almost in a circle, saying their prayers. After many sighs, they began to discuss among themselves various matters concerning the nature of the times. And after a while, when the others were silent, Pampania began to speak in this manner. My dear ladies, you have often heard, as I have, how proper use of reason can do harm to no one. It is only natural for everyone born on this earth to sustain, preserve, and defend his own life to the best of his ability. This is a right so taken for granted that it has at times permitted men to kill each other without blame in order to defend their own lives. And if the laws dealing with the welfare of every human being permit such a thing, how wrong or offensive could it be for us or anyone else to take all possible precautions to preserve our own lives? When I consider what we've been doing this morning and in the past days and what we have spoken about, I understand, and you must understand too, that each one of us is afraid for her life. Nor does this surprise me in the least. Rather, I am greatly amazed that since each of us has the natural feelings of a woman, we do not find some remedy for ourselves to cure what each one of us dreads. We live in the city, in my opinion, for no other reason than to bear witness to the number of dead bodies that are carried to burial, or to hear whether or not the friars, whose number has been reduced to almost nothing, chant their offices at the prescribed hours, or to demonstrate to anyone who comes here the quality and quantity of our miseries by the clothes we wear. And if we leave the church, either we see dead or sick bodies carried all about, or we see those who were once condemned to exile for their crimes by the authority of the public laws, making sport of these laws, running about wildly through the city, because they know that those who enforce those laws are either dead or dying. Or we see the scum of our city, excited with the scent of our blood, who call themselves Baccini, and who ride all over the place on horseback, mocking everything, and with their disgusting songs adding insult to our injuries. Nor do we hear anything but, so-and-so is dead, and so-and-so is dying, and if there were anyone left to mourn, we should hear nothing but piteous laments everywhere. I do not know if what happens to me also happens to you in your homes, but when I go home, I find no one there except my maid, and I become so afraid that my hair stands on end. True. And wherever I go or sit in my house, I seem to see the shadows of those who have passed away, not with the faces that I remember, but with horrible expressions that terrify me. For these reasons, I am uncomfortable here in church, outside, and in my home, and the more so since it appears that no one like ourselves who has the financial means and some other place to go has remained here except us. And if there were any who remain, according to what I hear and see, they do whatever their hearts desire, making no distinction between what is proper and what is not, whether they're alone or with others by day or night. And not only laymen, but also those who are cloistered in convents have broken their vows of obedience and have given themselves over to pleasures of the flesh. For they have made themselves believe that these things are permissible for them and are improper for others. And thinking that they will escape with their lives in this fashion, they have become wanton and dissolute. If this is the case, and plainly it is, what are we doing here? What are we waiting for? What are we dreaming about? Why are we slower to protect our health than all the rest of the citizens? Do we hold ourselves less dear than all the others do? Or do we believe that our own lives are tied to our bodies with stronger chains than others have, and therefore that we need not worry about anything which might have the power to harm them? We are mistaken and deceived, and we are mad if we believe this. We have clear proof of this. To have clear proof of this, we need only call to mind how many young men and ladies have been struck down by this cruel pestilence. I do not know if you agree with me, but I believe that in order not to fall prey out of reluctance or indifference to what we could well avoid, it might be a good idea for all of us to leave this city, just as many others before us have done and are still doing. Let us avoid, like death itself, the ugly example of others, and go to live in a more dignified fashion in our country houses, of which we all have several. And there let us take what enjoyment, what happiness, and what pleasure we can, without in any way going beyond the bounds of reason. There we can hear the birds sing, and we can see the hills and the pastures turning green, the wheat fields moving like the sea, and 1,000 kinds of trees. And we shall be able to see the heavens more clearly. The heavens which, though they still may be cruel, nonetheless will not deny to us their eternal beauties, and which are much more pleasing to look at than the deserted walls of our city. Besides all this, in the country the air is much fresher, and the necessities for living in such times as these are plentiful, and there are just fewer troubles in general. Though the peasants are dying there, even as the townspeople here, the displeasure is the less in that there are fewer houses and inhabitants than in the city. Here, on the other hand, if I judge correctly, we would not be abandoning anyone. On the contrary, we can honestly say it is we ourselves that have been abandoned, for our loved ones are either dead or have fled, and have left us on our own in the midst of such affliction as though we were no part of them. No reproach, therefore, can come to us if we follow this course of action, whereas sorrow, worry, and perhaps even death can come if we do not follow such a course. So, whenever you please, I think we should do well to take our servants, have everything we need sent after us, and go from one place one day to another the next, enjoying what happiness and merriment these times permit. Let us live in this manner, unless we are overtaken first by death, until we see what end heaven has in store for these horrible times. And remember that it is no less proper for us to leave blamelessly than it is for most other women to remain here dishonorably. When they had listened to what Pampania had said, the other ladies not only praised her advice, but were so anxious to follow it that they had already begun discussing among themselves the details, as if they were going to leave that very instant. But Philomena, who was very discerning, said, "Ladies, regardless of how convincing Pampinia's arguments are, that is no reason to rush into things, as you seem to wish to do. Remember that we are all women, and any young girl can tell you that women do not know how to reason in a group when they are without the guidance of some man who knows how to control them. We are fickle, quarrelsome, suspicious, timid, and fearful, because of which I suspect that this company will soon break up without honor to any of us if we do not take a guide other than ourselves. We would do well to resolve this matter before we depart." Then Alyssa said, "Men are truly the leaders of women, and without their guidance, our actions rarely end successfully. But how are we to find these men? We all know that the majority of our relatives are dead, and those who remain alive are scattered here and there in various groups and have no idea of where they are. They too are fleeing precisely what we seek to avoid. And since taking up with strangers would be unbecoming to us, we must, if we wish to leave for the sake of our health, find a means of arranging it so that while going for our own pleasure and repose, no trouble or scandal follows us." While the ladies were discussing this, 3 young men came into the church, none of whom was less than 25 years of age. Eligible bachelors, I'd say. Neither the perversity of the times, nor the loss of friends or parents, nor fear of their own lives had been able to cool, much less extinguish, the love they bore in their hearts. One of them was called Panfilo, another Philostrato, and the last Dionio. Each one very charming and well-bred, and in those turbulent times they sought their greatest consolation in the sight of the ladies they loved, all three of whom happened to be among the 7 ladies previously mentioned, while the others were close relatives of one or the other of the 3 men. No sooner had they sighted the ladies than they were seen by them, whereupon Pampinia smiled and said, "See how fortune favors our plans and has provided us with these judicious and virtuous young men, who would gladly be our guides and servants if we do not hesitate to accept them for such service." Then Neophile blushed out of embarrassment. I think she's the youngest one, for she was one of those who was loved by one of the young men, and she said, "Pampinia, for the love of God, be careful what you say. I realize very well that nothing but good can be said of any of them, and I believe that they are capable of doing much more than that task, and likewise that their good and worthy company would be fitting not only for us, but for ladies much more beautiful and attractive than we are. But it is quite obvious that some of them are in love with some of us who are present, and I fear that if we take them with us, disgrace and disapproval will follow. If you get my gist. Through no fault of ours or theirs, of course." Then Philomena said, "That does not matter at all, as long as I live with dignity and have no remorse of conscience about anything. Let anyone who wishes to say what he likes to the contrary. God and truth will take up arms in my defense. Now, if they were only willing to come with us, as Pampinia says, we could truly say that fortune was favorable to our departure." When the others heard her speak in such a manner, the argument was ended, and they all agreed that the young men should be called over, told about their intentions, and asked if they would be so kind as to accompany the ladies on such a journey. Without further discussion, then, Pampinia, who was related to one of the men, rose to her feet and made her way to where they stood gazing at the ladies, and she greeted them with a cheerful expression, outlined their plan, and begged them, in everyone's name, to keep them company in the spirit of pure and brotherly affection. At first the young men thought they were being mocked, but when they saw that the lady was speaking seriously, they gladly consented, and in order to start without delay and put the plan into action, before leaving the church they agreed upon what preparations had to be made for their departure. And when everything had been arranged and word had been sent on to the place they intended to go, because servants, the following morning, that is Wednesday, at the break of dawn, the ladies with some of their servants and the 3 young men with 3 of their servants left the city and set out on their way. They had traveled no further than 2 short miles when they arrived at the first stop they had agreed upon. The place was somewhere on a little mountain, at some distance from the road, full of different kinds of shrubs and plants with rich green foliage. Most pleasant to look at the top of this hill there was a country mansion with a beautiful large inner courtyard containing loggias, halls, and bedrooms, all of them beautifully proportioned and decorated with gay and interesting paintings. It was surrounded by meadows and marvelous gardens, with wells of cool water and cellars full of the most precious wines, the likes of which were more suitable for expert drinkers than for dignified and respectable ladies. I beg to differ. And the group discovered, to no little delight, that the entire palace had been cleaned. All the beds had been made, fresh flowers were everywhere, and the floors had been strewn with rushes. It must be nice to have servants. Soon after they arrived and were resting, Dionio, who was more attractive and wittier than either of the other young men, said, "Ladies, more than our preparations, it was your intelligence that guided us here. I do not know what you intend to do with your troubled thoughts, but I left mine inside the city walls when I passed through them in your company a little while ago, and so you must either make up your minds to enjoy yourselves and laugh and sing with me, as much, let me say, as your dignity permits, or you must give me leave to return to my worries and to remain in our troubled city." To this, Pampinia, who had driven away her sad thoughts in the same way, replied happily, Dionio, what you say is very true. Let us live happily, for after all, it was unhappiness that made us flee the city. But when things lack order, they cannot long endure. And since it was I who began the discussions which brought this fine company together, and since I desire the continuation of our happiness, I think we should choose a leader from among us, whom we shall honor and obey as our superior, and whose only thought shall be to keep us happily entertained. And in order that each one of us may feel the burden of this responsibility together with the pleasure of its authority, so that no one of us who has not experienced it can envy the others, let me say that both the burden and the honor should be granted to each one of us in turn for a day. The first will be elected by all of us. Then, as the hour of vespers approaches, it will be the duty of the one who rules for that day to choose his or her successor. This ruler, as long as his reign endures, will prescribe the place and manner in which we shall spend our time. These words greatly pleased everyone, and they unanimously elected Pampinea queen for the first day. Philomena quickly ran to a laurel bush, whose leaves she had always heard were worthy of praise, and bestowed great honor upon those crowned with them. She plucked several branches from it and wove them into a handsome garland of honor, which, whenever it was placed upon the head of any of them, was to be to all in the group a definite symbol of royal rule and authority over the rest of them for as long as their company stayed together. After she had been chosen queen, Pampinea ordered everyone to refrain from talking. Then she sent for the 4 servants of the ladies and for those of the 3 young men, and as they stood before her in silence, she said, so that I may set the first example for all of you, which may be bettered and thus allow our company to live an orderly and pleasurable existence without any shame for as long as we wish, I first appoint Parmeno, Dionio's servant, as my steward, and I commit to his care and management all our household and everything which pertains to the services of the dining hall. I want Cerisco, Panfilo's servant, to act as our buyer and treasurer, and to follow Parmeno's orders. Tindaro, who is in the service of Philostrato, shall wait on Philostrato and Dionio and Panfilo in their bedchambers when the other 2 are occupied with their other duties and cannot do so. Mysia, my servant, and Lysiska, Philomena's, will be occupied in the kitchen and will prepare those dishes which are ordered by Parmeno. Chimera, Loretta's servant, and Stratilia, Fiametta's servant, will take care of the bedchambers of the ladies and the cleaning of those places we use. And in general, we desire and command each of you, if you value our favor and good graces, to be sure, no matter where you go or come from, no matter what you hear or see, to bring us back nothing but good news. And once these orders, announced so summarily and praised by all present, were delivered, Pampinea rose happily to her feet and said, here there are gardens and meadows and many other delightful places which all of us can wander about in and enjoy as we like. But at the hour of tierce, I don't know what time that is. We'll find out. Let everyone be here so that we can eat in the cool of the morning. After the merry group had been given the new queen's permission, the young men, together with the beautiful ladies, set off slowly through a garden, discussing pleasant matters, weaving themselves lovely garlands of various leaves and singing love songs. After the time granted them by the queen had elapsed, they returned home and found Parmeno busy carrying out the duties of his task. For as they entered a hall on the ground floor, they saw the tables set with the whitest of linens, and with glasses that shone like silver, and everything decorated with broom blossom. Then they washed their hands for 20 seconds or more, and at the queen's command, they all sat down in the places assigned them by Parmeno. The delicately cooked foods were brought in, and fine wines were ready to be poured. Then, without a word, the 3 servants began to serve the tables. Everyone was delighted to see everything so beautiful and well arranged, and the meal was accompanied by merriment and pleasant conversation. Since all the ladies and young men knew how to dance, and some of them even knew how to play music and sing very well, when the tables had been cleared, the queen ordered that instruments be brought, and on her command Dionio picked up a lute, and Fiammetta a viola, and they began softly playing a dance tune. After the queen had sent the servants off to eat, she began to dance a carolla with the other ladies and 2 of the young men. And when that was over, they all began to sing gay and carefree songs. In this manner they continued until the queen felt that it was time to retire. Therefore, at the queen's request, the 3 young men went off to their chambers, which were separate from those of the ladies, where they found their beds prepared and the rooms as full of flowers as the halls. The ladies, too, discovered their chambers decorated in like fashion. Then they all undressed and lay down to rest. Not long after the hour of nones, the queen arose and had the other ladies and young men awakened, stating that too much sleep in the daytime was harmful. Then they went out into a meadow whose tall green grass was protected from the sun, and there, with a gentle breeze caressing them, they all sat in a circle upon the green grass, as was the wish of their queen. She then spoke to them in this manner: "As you see, the sun is high, the heat is great, and nothing can be heard except the cicadas in the olive groves. Therefore, to wander about at this hour would indeed be foolish. Here it is cool and fresh, and as you can see, there are games and chessboards with which all of you can amuse yourselves to your liking. But if you take my advice in this matter, I suggest we spend this hot part of the day not playing games, a pastime which of necessity disturbs the player who loses without providing much pleasure either for his opponents or for those who watch, but rather telling stories. For this way, one person, by telling a story, can provide amusement for the entire company. In the time it takes for the sun to set and the heat to become less oppressive, you will each have told a little story, and then we can go wherever we like to amuse ourselves. So, if what I say pleases you, and in this I am willing to follow your pleasure, then let us do it. If not, then let everyone do as he or she pleases until the hour of vespers." The entire group of young men and young ladies liked the idea of telling stories. She's pretty convincing, huh? "Oh, then," said the queen, "if this is your wish for this first day, I wish for each of you to be free to tell a story treating any subject which most pleases you." And turning to Panfilo, who sat on her right, she ordered him, in a most gracious manner, to begin with one of his stories. Whereupon, hearing her command, Panfilo, with everyone listening, began at once as follows.